They said the ground was too frozen to bury the dead that winter, but they didn't know that Cora Vance had spent months digging her own grave just to stay alive. On the morning she split the last of the seasoned oak, the sky above the Kansas high plains had gone the color of old, forgotten pewter. It was not the clean, predictable gray of ordinary autumn rain clouds, but something significantly heavier and more deliberate, as if the atmosphere itself had made a silent, unyielding decision to test the limits of anyone daring to occupy the prairie. She stood at the heavy white oak chopping block behind the cabin. Her father, Arthur Vance, had built with his own calloused hands, her movements carrying the particular, unhurried economy of a person who had spent her entire life understanding that waste was the quickest path to ruin. Each heavy stroke of her cedar-handled axe met the grain of the wood at precisely the angle required to cleave it cleanly, requiring no more force than was necessary to send the split halves tumbling into the dust to her left and right, like a series of practical problems solved. Her shoulders and back held the dense, quiet strength of someone who had earned her place on the land through years of sustained effort rather than months of hopeful enthusiasm, possessing the kind of deep, internal muscle that rarely shows itself in polite company, but surprises everyone when a heavy load must be lifted. Cora paused between logs, not because her arms had grown tired, but because the wind had changed. She tilted her face toward the northwest, where the horizon had begun to take on a bruised, yellowish cast beneath the pewter clouds, a strange, flat color that had no business appearing in the middle of October. The cottonwoods along the South Fork Creek bed had already shed their summer gold, their bare silver branches scratching at the dry wind like thin, desperate fingers reaching out for a warmth that had already departed. The buffalo grass in every direction lay flattened and straw-colored, pressed hard against the dry earth by a westerly breeze that had begun 3 days ago as a mere suggestion and was now becoming an absolute declaration of what was to come. Cora lowered the axe head to the chopping block, resting her gloved hands on the pommel of the handle, and stood there reading the sky the way her father had taught her to read every surface of the natural world. She did not look at the sky for what it appeared to be, but for what it was actively doing, noticing the high, wispy mare's tails of cloud migrating south, the sharp rise in barometric pressure that made her ears click, and the particular, chalky dryness in the air that sat at the back of her throat. She was 26 years old, and she had occupied these 160 acres of high plains since her father carried her across the territory on his back at the age of 3, after their wagon axle had snapped in a dry wallow. Arthur Vance had decided on that very afternoon that a man who could not protect his family from a broken axle had no business traveling further west, and so he had driven his claim stake into the sod and built their lives from the ground upward. He had been a stonemason by training in the old country and a farmer by sheer necessity, a quiet man who understood the world through its physical weight and density rather than through the promises of land speculators or the abstract comfort of town assemblies. He knew the compressive strength of native limestone versus the porous sandstone of the southern ridges, and he understood exactly how a wall built without mortar had to lean to keep from sliding under the weight of wet spring snow. Most importantly, he had taught Cora that the earth beneath their feet had a long memory, longer than any family's grievance or any county court's written deed, and that if you dug deep enough, the ground held a constant warmth that did not care what the sky was doing. Arthur Vance had died in the winter of 1881 from a lung fever that had taken him in November and refused to release him, leaving Cora to bury him herself in ground. She had to break with a pickaxe because the neighbors were weathered down. She had not cried then, choosing to save her energy for the work of survival, but had wept instead in the spring when the soil finally softened enough to plant a wild rose beside his marker, the grief arriving without warning, like something that had been waiting patiently outside the door until the chores were finished. For 2 years, she had worked the claim alone, giving the land everything it asked of her, and receiving in return a quiet, sufficient survival that her father had always told her was the only honest measurement of wealth a person could possess. The creak of iron-rimmed wagon wheels on the hard-packed dirt of the yard was the first warning that her isolation was about to be interrupted. Cora did not stop her work immediately. She placed one more log on the block, split it cleanly down the center, and stacked the halves on her pile before turning to face the eastern rise where the road came down from Duswell. The wagon was pulled by two raw-boned bay horses, their coats already showing the rough, shaggy texture of early winter, and on the bench seat sat two men she recognized long before the team had come to a halt near her well house. Aldous Peck sat on the right side of the seat, holding his leather satchel on his knee, with the self-contained stillness of a man who had long ago discovered that he did not need to raise his voice to make people move in the direction he preferred. He was 54 years old, broad-shouldered and dressed in a dark wool coat of expensive city cut that seemed designed to signal his financial position rather than to offer any practical protection against the wind that scoured the prairie. Beside him sat Sheriff Thomas Miller, a large, apologetic man who held the reins loosely, his gaze fixed on a point on the horizon beyond Cora's left shoulder, as if he were trying to find something in the empty distance that would excuse his presence in her yard. Peck did not descend from the wagon immediately. He waited for the dust to settle, then opened his satchel with a deliberate, organized movement and removed a single sheet of paper, which he held out toward Cora as she walked slowly to the side of the wheel. "The county court has completed its review, Miss Vance," Peck said, his voice carrying the smooth, flat tone of an administrative clerk, delivering a decision that had already been settled in a room 300 miles away. "This is a deed of transfer for the 160 acres of this claim, including the cabin, the barn, and all structures currently standing on the property, executed under the authority of the district judge in Topeka." Cora did not reach for the paper. She stood with her hands flat against her sides, her face showing nothing of the sudden coldness that had begun to settle in her stomach as she looked at the document. "My father paid every debt he contracted, Mr. Peck," she said, her voice matching the level, unhurried pace of her chopping. "I have his ledger in the cabin, and every transaction he entered has been balanced to zero before the column was closed." "Your father's private ledger is not a legal instrument, Miss Vance," Peck replied, his face remaining entirely neutral as he pointed to the bottom of the deed where a signature had been written in dark, heavy ink. "Arthur Vance contracted a debt of $400 with my land office in the summer of 1880 to purchase seed and equipment, and this claim was held as security against that obligation. The note has expired, and the property has been transferred to my ownership to satisfy the balance." Cora looked at the signature on the paper, her eyes focusing on the shape of the letters with the intense, methodical attention her father had trained her to bring to any structural drawing. The writing was a clever imitation someone had spent hours studying Arthur Vance's hand, copying the heavy, deliberate pressure he brought to the pen and the compact spacing of his letters. But the writer had missed the one detail that could not be copied: the tremor. In the last 3 years of his life, Arthur's right hand had developed a persistent, microscopic shake from decades of lifting heavy stone hammers, and that tremor meant that the loop of his capital letters, particularly the O in Vance, was always closed tight, almost pinched into a narrow point at the top. The signature on Peck's document had a wide, generous O that had been drawn with a smooth, continuous stroke of a hand that had never held a stone hammer in its life, and the tail of the final E pulled upward in a small, elegant flourish that her father's horizontal penmanship would have rejected as useless decoration. "My father did not write that name," Cora said, her voice remaining quiet but steady in the wind. "The man who signed this paper did not have stone dust in his skin." Peck did not argue. He simply returned the document to his satchel and nodded once to Sheriff Miller, who finally shifted his gaze down from the horizon to look at Cora with a look of genuine regret. "The law doesn't look at the skin, Cora," Miller said, his voice low and embarrassed. "The seal of the county court is on that paper, and my office is obligated to enforce it. Mr. Peck has agreed to give you until the first significant snow of the season to move your belongings into town, but if you're still here when the drifts block the road, I'll have to come back and remove you myself." "The sky in the northwest is already yellow, Sheriff," Cora said, pointing toward the horizon where the pewter clouds were thickening. "You won't have to wait until December for your snow." Peck pulled his wool coat tighter around his neck and adjusted his hat against a sudden gust of wind. "Then I suggest you begin packing your wagon this afternoon, Miss Vance," he said. The town has rooms available for those who are willing to cooperate, but the prairie is not forgiving to those who choose to be stubborn. The 5-mile walk into the settlement of Duswell was a silent journey through a landscape that seemed to be actively preparing for a siege. Cora walked at her father's steady, measured pace, her boots striking the frozen dirt of the trail with an orderly rhythm that kept her mind focused on the immediate requirements of the day rather than on the empty house she had left behind. She carried her small cloth purse in her gloved hand, the few silver coins inside clicking together with a dry, metallic sound that seemed to mock the vastness of the prairie surrounding her. As she entered the town's main street, she noticed that the usual activity of the settlement had been muted by the cold. The horses at the hitching rails stood with their heads lowered against the wind, their breath rising in thick, white clouds that vanished into the gray air, and the few townspeople she passed found reasons to look at their boots or slip inside doorways before they had to meet her eyes. She walked into Weaver's general store, the smell of kerosene, dried apples, and vinegar hitting her face as she stepped through the door and closed it against the wind. Isaac Weaver stood behind his long pine counter, his hands occupied with a dry cloth that he was using to polish the glass surface of a candy jar, his movements holding the nervous, repetitive quality of a man who was trying to avoid a conversation he had been dreading all morning. He did not look up when she approached the counter, keeping his eyes fixed on the glass until she set her purse down with a quiet, solid click. "I need a small sack of salt, Isaac," Cora said, her voice carrying no anger or desperation, "and 2 boxes of matches and a single needle with a bone eye if you have one." Weaver set the cloth down, but did not put his hands on the counter. "I can't do it on the book, Cora," he said, his voice low and strained as he looked at the shelves behind her. "Gideon Croft came by yesterday evening with the county ledger. He's taken over the notes on my fall stock delivery, and he's made it a condition of my own credit that I don't extend any accounts to those who are currently in dispute with his office. He was very specific about the names. Cora." "I have the silver, Isaac," she said, opening her purse and placing 3 coins on the pine counter between them. "I'm not asking for credit. I'm asking for what the silver buys." Weaver looked at the coins for a long moment, then reached under the counter to retrieve her items, his movements quick and embarrassed as if he wanted the transaction completed before anyone else entered the store. "I'm sorry about this, Cora," he whispered as he wrapped the needle in a scrap of paper and placed in her sack. "Your father was a good man, and he did honest work for half the families in this valley. But Croft has the banks behind him in Topeka, and a man with a store to keep can't afford to look too closely at how the land changes hands." "I understand, Isaac," Cora said, her voice remaining level and polite. "A store is a heavy thing to hold in a wind. Please subscribe to our channel if you are finding this story of frontier resilience valuable. Every week we bring you real historical survival techniques that worked when life depended on them." She walked out of the store into the cold street, her purse significantly lighter, but her sack containing the precise tools she had come to buy. As she turned west toward the hills, she noticed that Bramble, her shaggy brown nanny goat, had escaped her pen and was waiting patiently near the livery stable, her amber eyes holding that calm, unhurried expression that had always made her look more like a quiet partner than an animal. The goat fell in beside Cora's left knee as they left the town behind, her hooves clicking on the frozen trail with a steady, comforting rhythm. Cora looked up at the sky, noting that the wild geese had gone 2 weeks ahead of their usual schedule, their high, gray V formations having passed over the claim on the 18th of October instead of the first week of November. She had noted their departure in her father's old ledger, writing the date in her own neat, compact hand beneath his last entry, because she knew that the land kept its own records if you were willing to pay attention to where the ink ended and the winter began. The decision to turn west toward the hills was not a sudden impulse born of desperation. It was the calculated execution of a plan that her father had begun outlining in her mind long before the first surveyor's stake had been driven into their yard. As the wagon tracks behind her faded into the light dusting of dry snow that had begun to cover the trail, Cora walked with her pack settled comfortably against her shoulders, its weight distributed evenly across her back by the thick canvas straps her father had stitched with heavy leather thread. She did not look back at the log cabin, standing silent in the middle of the empty claim. not from any dramatic effort of will, but because she understood that looking back at a shelter you no longer owned was an operational waste of energy when the trail in front of you required your entire attention. The wind was coming hard from the west-northwest now, carrying the smell of frozen shale and distant pine forests, and it hit her right cheek with a steady, numbing pressure that she used to calibrate her pace, ensuring she did not overheat and sweat beneath her wool coat. Bramble walked beside her, her shaggy brown coat already showing the thick, oily undercoat that goats develop when the winter intends to be severe, her amber eyes scanning the brush with a quiet, ancien intelligence. Cora had never known the goat to be wrong about the path. When the wind rose to a frequency that indicated a coming squall, Bramble would naturally incline her head toward the leeward side of the ridges, finding the small, natural pockets of still air where a creature could rest without losing her body heat to the convective draft. They moved together up the long, rising slope of the first significant ridge, where the soil turned from the dark, rich loam of the valley floor to the thin, gravelly clay of the high plains, the grass growing sparser and more shriveled until there was nothing but native sage and broken shale beneath their feet. Cora's father had always told her that the earth had a memory, not a soft, sentimental memory like a human's, but a hard, physical memory that could be measured in degrees and compressive strength. "If you dig 4 feet down, Cora," he had said to her on a hot July afternoon when they were clearing limestone from the western slope, "the ground doesn't know about July, and it doesn't know about January. It only knows about 50 degrees. It holds that warmth like a secret, and it'll keep it for you through the worst storm the sky can think up, as long as you're smart enough to go down and ask for it." He had spent his life working with that secret, understanding that the absolute stability of the subsurface earth was a resource more reliable than any county bank or any politician's promise, and he had built his survival on that reliability. The snow began falling in earnest as they cleared the first crest, the small, hard grains of ice drumming on the canvas of her pack with a dry, rhythmic sound like sand hitting a pane of glass. The visibility dropped to 50 yards within minutes, the horizon vanishing into a uniform white stillness that made the surrounding hills look like empty space. But Cora did not slow her pace. She knew the landmarks through their physical transitions, the place where the shale gave way to limestone, the specific angle of the slope that indicated they were approaching the cedar grove, and the particular scent of dry cedar needles that always sat in the air near the western boundary of their claim. She followed Bramble through a narrow draw between 2 low ridges, where the wind went suddenly quiet, the silence of the snow-filled air settling over them like a heavy wool blanket. The earth was already beginning to bury the path behind them, but Cora was not looking for a path. She was looking for a tree she had known since childhood, a native red cedar whose growth had been shaped by decades of northwest wind into a permanent, eastward lean, its roots exposed on the uphill side where the erosion of the hillside had worked patiently for half a century to reveal what lay beneath the soil. The cedar tree stood exactly where her memory had placed it, its shaggy, dark green branches holding a heavy weight of dry snow that she had to brush aside to reach the base of the trunk. Beneath the exposed roots on the uphill side, nearly hidden by decades of fallen needles and accumulated forest debris, lay a flat limestone slab that looked to any casual observer like a natural part of the hillside's rocky outcrop. But Cora knew the slab had been split by her father's wedges. Its edges were too regular, its horizontal level too precise to have been produced by the random shifts of the mountain soil, and she set her pack down in the shelter of the cedar branches before retrieving her axe from her pack. She did not use the cutting edge. She turned the tool in her hands to use the flat, heavy pole of the head as a wedge, working the steel into the narrow seam between the limestone slab and the earth where the frost cycle of the previous winters had opened a microscopic gap. The stone was heavy. Arthur Vance had chosen a piece of native limestone weighing nearly 200 pounds, designed specifically to discourage any casual investigation by passing hunters or land speculators who might stumble across the site during the summer months. Cora had to brace her feet against the cedar roots and throw her entire weight against the handle of the axe, her back and shoulders straining against the resistance of the stone until she felt the soil beneath it give way with a wet, sucking sound. She walked the stone sideways, inch by inch, using the axe handle as a lever, until the opening beneath was wide enough to admit her shoulders. The air that rose from the opening was the most remarkable thing about it. It carried no chill, no scent of the freezing storm that was currently burying the hillside above. It was cool, dry, and smelled of native shale, dry clay, and the faint, clean scent of cedar shavings her father had scattered across the floor years ago to keep the space fresh. She struck a match from her weaver's box, shielding the small flame with her hand as she peered down into the darkness. The steps were flat limestone blocks, set into the earthen wall of the shaft, with the same meticulous regularity her father brought to every staircase he had ever constructed, descending 9 feet down to a solid rock floor. She descended slowly, Bramble following her without hesitation, her hooves clicking on the stone steps with a familiar, confident sound that echoed in the quiet chamber. Cora struck a second match and lit a tallow candle she found in a wooden crate near the base of the stairs, the small yellow flame revealing a room that measured exactly 9 feet wide by 11 feet long. The walls were lined with local sandstone blocks, laid without mortar in the dry stack style her father had learned from his grandfather in the old country, each stone chosen for its flat faces and substantial density, fitted together so tightly that the weight of the hill above pressed them into a single, unyielding structure that required no binding agent to maintain its integrity. Against the far wall stood the emergency provisions her father had helped her accumulate over the years, each item sealed in oilcloth or stored in tight wooden crates to protect them from the ambient humidity of the earth. 2 50-pound sacks of dried pinto beans, a sealed tin of flour, 3 packages of salt pork and salt crust, and 4 tins of lard sat arranged in an orderly row near the corner. Beside them lay the tools she would need to make the space livable: a hand-cranked wood auger, a short crosscut saw, a flathead shovel, and a pickaxe with a new hickory handle. On top of the food crate, placed with a deliberate prominence that indicated it was intended to be found first, lay a small oilskin pouch sealed with a brass clip. Cora opened the pouch and removed the single sheet of paper inside, her eyes focusing on the neat, compact handwriting she had not seen since her father's death. The ink was faded but legible, and the letters had that characteristic rightward lean of a man who wrote on his knee by the light of a single candle. "If you found this, Cora, you'll know what to do. The earth is warm, the stone is solid, and the wood is dry. What your hands build is yours alone, and no county court can write a deed for what lies beneath the frost line." She held the paper for a moment, her fingers tracing the tight loop of the capital O in his name, feeling the weight of his foresight settling over her like a physical hand. He had not built the stove. He had left the raw materials in the corner, the clay, the ironwood pipes, the flat stones, because he had understood that a shelter built entirely by another person's hands was never truly a shelter, and that she would need the work of construction to claim the space as her own. The work of building the stove began as soon as she had cleared the snow from her boots and hung her coat from a wooden peg her father had driven into the ceiling beams. In the northeast corner of the chamber, stacked with the neatness of a professional job site, lay the materials Arthur Vance had left behind: 30 flat-faced limestone blocks, 2 sections of fired clay pipe, 3 pieces of hollow ironwood log for the flue, and a canvas sack containing 50 pounds of dry, red clay he had dug from the creek bank years before. Cora retrieved the clay sack and emptied half its contents into her cast-iron pot, then added snow she had scooped from the entrance stairs, working the mixture with her bare hands until the dry crumble turned into a smooth, elastic mortar. Her father had taught her that clay mortar was a living material. It had to be worked until it held the moisture without becoming slick, its density sufficient to seal the joints against smoke, while remaining flexible enough to absorb the intense thermal expansion of a wood fire. She kneaded the clay with her knuckles, adding small pinches of dry prairie grass from a bundle in the crate to act as a binder, her fingers remembering the correct resistance long before her mind could articulate the formula. When the mortar was ready, she began laying the foundation stones for the firebox, choosing the 4 largest, flattest limestone blocks for the base and setting them directly on the native rock floor. She built the firebox 2 feet square and 2 feet high, applying the clay mortar sparingly with her fingers, pressing each stone down until she heard the reassuring clink of stone meeting stone through the thin seam of clay. She knew that the stability of a dry-stack stove depended on the direct contact of the stone faces. The clay was only there to seal the gaps against draft leaks, not to support the weight of the structure. If you relied on the mortar to hold the stone, her father had always warned, the first hot fire would burn the moisture out of the clay, causing the mortar to shrink and the stove to collapse under its own weight. At the 18-inch mark, she positioned the two sections of fired clay pipe that would serve as the primary ventilation system. The intake pipe was set low in the north wall, its outer end projecting through the limestone facing into a narrow air shaft her father had excavated to the hillside surface, while the exhaust pipe was set high in the south corner, connecting directly to the hollow ironwood flue. Cora sealed the joints with double layers of clay mortar, smoothing the seams with her thumb until they were airtight, ensuring that the draft would move cleanly from the floor level across the firebox and out through the ceiling. She laid the final flat sandstone slab across the top of the firebox to serve as her cooking surface, sealing the perimeter with a thick bead of clay mortar that she pressed flat with her hand. The stove sat compact and solid in the corner, its stone walls holding the quiet, heavy strength of native rock, its design adapted precisely to the limited volume of the chamber. It was not a beautiful piece of masonry. The stones were rough, the mortar seams irregular and stained with red clay, but it held the structural integrity her father's training required. And she knew that once the clay cured, the stones would hold a fire for 12 hours on a single armload of wood. Please like this video if you are enjoying Cora's journey. Your support helps our channel grow and allows us to continue sharing these stories of historical resilience and practical frontier wisdom. She stood back and wiped her hands on her trousers, her shoulders aching from the work, but her mind settled into the orderly logic of the task. Above her, she could hear the wind rising to a higher frequency as the storm committed its full strength to the hillside, the snow already beginning to accumulate over the limestone slab she had left partially open to allow the smoke to escape during the build. She had one final step before she could light the fire. She had to clear the chimney passage of any dry leaves or debris that might have accumulated during the autumn months, and she retrieved the long coil of wire from her supply crate to begin the test. The first match Cora struck caught the dry grass binder with an immediate bright flash, the small flame spreading into the pine bark kindling she had arranged in the center of the firebox with a satisfying crackle. She closed the heavy ironwood door she had fitted to the front of the stove and stood back, expecting to see the smoke rise cleanly through the upper pipe and out into the storm above. For approximately 4 seconds, the draft held. She could hear the fire begin to draw, the air moving through the low intake pipe with a quiet, whistling note that indicated the pressure differential was working exactly as designed. But then, the whistle stopped. The draft went dead quiet, and a thick, yellowish column of acrid wood smoke began pouring out from the seams of the firebox door, filling the chamber within seconds with a dark, suffocating cloud that made her eyes burn and her chest contract. Cora did not panic. She threw her wool coat over the stove doors to smother the oxygen supply, then dropped to her knees near the floor-level intake pipe, pressing her face against the clay opening to draw the fresh, cold air that was still filtering in from the outside. She lay there in the near darkness, her lungs aching from the smoke, her mind working through the physical variables of the system with the methodical precision her father had trained her to bring to any structural failure. "A stove is a simple engine, Cora," he had always told her. "If it doesn't draw, it's not because the wood is bad or the sky is angry. It's because there's an obstruction in the line or the cold air in the chimney is too heavy to let the hot smoke rise. Find the weight, and you'll find the draft." She struck a match, shielding her eyes from the remaining smoke, and examined the high exhaust pipe where it met the ceiling timber. The clay seal was intact, showing no cracks or leaks, which meant the obstruction lay further up the line where the ironwood flue penetrated the hillside surface. Cora climbed the stone stairs to the entrance, pushing her way through the fresh snow that had already accumulated over the limestone slab, and struggled out onto the windswept hillside. The storm was relentless, the wind screaming out of the northwest at 40 miles per hour, but Cora kept her head down and fought her way to the leeward side of the cedar tree where the chimney pipe emerged from the earth. She worked the long wire she had retrieved from her crate into the opening of the pipe, her fingers numbing quickly in the $-10 circ text $F air as she pushed the steel down into the darkness. At the 3-inch mark, the wire met solid resistance. Not the spongy feel of accumulated pine needles, but the hard, dry block of a piece of oak bark that had been driven into the pipe by the autumn wind and wedged tight against the ironwood wall. She twisted the wire, working the tip around the edges of the bark, her shoulders straining against the resistance, until she felt the obstruction give way with a quiet, scraping sound. She blew into the pipe from outside, confirming that the passage was clear by the sudden, free movement of the air through the line, then scrambled back down the steps into the shelter of the chamber. When she relit the kindling, the smoke rose without hesitation, threading through the upper pipe with a clean, steady draw that established itself within 30 seconds as a quiet but decisive current of air moving from the floor-level intake to the high exhaust. She began digging the cold sink channel along the perimeter of the floor, using her flathead shovel to cut a 4-inch wide trench through the native clay. This simple channel would catch the heaviest, coldest air as it settled toward the floor and hold it below her living level, keeping the chamber's active temperature significantly warmer than the ground itself. Finally, she hung her father's wool blankets from the ceiling beams to form the inner 5x5-foot tent, concentrating the stove's heat in a smaller, highly insulated space where she and Bramble could sleep without wasting fuel on the larger room. The cold that arrived on the 5th day of her occupancy was of a different category than the storm that had preceded it. The wind, which had been a constant howling presence through the high chimney pipe, went dead quiet in the early hours before dawn, leaving behind a silence so absolute that Cora could hear the shaggy red cedar's branches creaking from the contraction of the wood. The sky cleared to a deep, crystalline blue, the signature deception of a high plains norther that made the landscape look temperate from inside, while the thermometer she had hung from the ceiling beam dropped steadily past $-20 circ text $F, and then past $-30 circ text $F. By noon on January 2nd, the official temperature in the valley had reached $-42 circ text $F. It was the kind of cold that scoured the air of all moisture, turning the atmosphere into something hard and visible, like polished glass, where every breath rose in a thick, frozen cloud that fell back to the snow as a fine powder. Above ground, the snow had drifted 8 feet deep against the north side of the cedar tree, burying the limestone entrance slab completely beneath a massive, white dome that insulated the chamber's roof from the sub-zero air. Cora sat inside her blanket tent, her coat discarded, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee she had brewed from melted snow on the firebox capstone. The thermometer on her cedar plank platform read $58 circ text $F a stable, comfortable warmth maintained by the radiant heat of the 3 river stones she had placed on the stove's cap. She fed the firebox 3 small pieces of split oak every 4 hours, her wood consumption running at less than half the rate her father had estimated for their cabin, because her subterranean walls were protected from the wind chill that scoured the valley below. Bramble lay beside her, chewing her cud with the relaxed indifference of an animal that had discovered her own role in the thermal balance. The goat's body heat, combined with the insulation value of the earth and the high efficiency of the stone stove, had created a microclimate inside the tent that held its temperature independent of the sky's movements. Cora spent the long afternoon reading her father's worn copy of Marcus Aurelius, her fingers tracing the faded print as she sat in the steady, quiet warmth. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Realize that the earth is not your adversary, but your material foundation, and you will find a strength that does not depend on the weather. Please subscribe to our channel if you are finding this story of historical ingenuity inspiring. We share weekly accounts of frontier survival that prove how traditional knowledge can overcome the most severe challenges. She looked at the stone walls, noting how the dry stack joints showed no signs of condensation or frost, the natural movement of the air through the ventilation pipes, keeping the chamber dry and fresh despite the absence of any mechanical systems. The sandstone blocks her father had chosen were performing exactly as he'd promised, holding the stove's heat like a battery and releasing it so slowly that she woke each morning to a space that still held $52. Circ, text, F dollar, even when the fire had burned down to embers hours before. While the valley below was locked in a life-threatening struggle against the cold, Cora's keep remained a place of silent, structured comfort, a solution engineered entirely from the ground's own memory and the simple laws of thermodynamics. In the valley below her hillside, the winter of 1883 was conducting itself as an administrative disaster for those who had relied on conventional building practices and expensive materials. At the Vance cabin, which Gideon Croft had occupied since November to assert his ownership of the claim, the physical limitations of standard construction were revealing themselves with a slow, relentless clarity that no legal document could excuse. The cabin was a solid structure by town standards, its spruce logs chinked with clay and moss, but it sat exposed on the open plains, catching the full force of the northwest wind like an obstruction in a river. The wind scoured the log walls, finding every minute gap in the chinking, pulling the warm air out of the interior through convective cooling faster than the large stone fireplace could replace it. Croft had his foreman running a team of 3 hands to haul firewood from the creek bed, burning through a cord of oak every 4 days, just to keep the main room at a barely tolerable $45, circ, text, F dollar. The bedrooms, far from the fireplace, had dropped to $28, circ, text, F dollar overnight, forcing Croft and his men to sleep in their heavy coats near the hearth, their breath freezing on the log surfaces above their heads in thick, gray sheets of frost. But the real crisis was happening in the new barn Croft had constructed in September to house his prize-breeding cattle. The building had been framed with unseasoned green pine, a material chosen by his contractor because it was cheap and available, but that had begun to contract and warp as the sub-zero cold dried the wood. By December, the vertical siding boards had separated, opening half-inch gaps along the entire north wall, through which the $-30, circ, text, F dollar wind moved with the purposeful ease of an invading force. The cattle huddled together in the center of the drafty barn, their body reserves burning up rapidly as they fought to maintain their core temperature against the wind chill. Croft's foreman had tried stuffing the gaps with straw, with canvas, with old feed sacks, but the material was scoured out by the wind within hours, leaving the animals exposed once more to the killing draft. 3 of his best Herefords had developed the rattling, wet cough of advanced pneumonia by the first week of January, their weight dropping by 50 pounds each as their bodies redirected all energy away from growth toward survival. At the general store in Duswell, Isaac Weaver sat behind a counter that had gone so cold he had to wear wool mittens to handle the coins, his inventory of kerosene and matches nearly exhausted by families who were rationing their remaining supplies in desperation. The town's social cohesion had begun to show the same cracks as the green pine in Croft's barn, the shared misery of the cold producing a quiet, guarded distance between neighbors who could no longer afford to offer help that might compromise their own survival. The church at the end of the street sat dark and empty, Reverend Hayes having suspended services after the communion wine froze solid in the chalice on Christmas morning, the building's uninsulated walls turning the sanctuary into an icebox where any spoken word hung in the air as a frozen mist. Croft stood at the cabin window on the evening of January 8th, his face pinched with cold and frustration as he watched his men struggle to split frozen green pine in the yard. He had built his entire financial position on the predictable behavior of legal and economic systems, but those systems were currently powerless against the $-30, circ, text, F dollar reality that was dismantling his investment piece by piece. He looked up at the western hills, where the silhouette of the red cedar tree was barely visible against the dark sky, and felt a sudden, sharp resentment toward the woman. He'd tried to evict a woman who had gone into the cold with nothing but an axe and a goat, and who had apparently found a way to outlast the very winter that was currently ruining him. The sound at the entrance slab came in the 4th hour of the morning, during that deepest, coldest window of the night, when the temperature outside had settled at $-39, circ, text, F $1, and the rest of the world had gone entirely still. Cora was already awake, her father's training having built in her a persistent internal clock that woke her every 4 hours to tend the firebox, and she stood in the center of the chamber with her axe in her hand, listening to the muffled, scraping noise from above. It was not the sound of wind-blown branches or the settling of the cedar roots. It was a rhythmic, desperate scratching of human hands against the frozen stone, followed by a voice so thin and ragged it sounded like a dry leaf moving across ice. "Miss Calloway, please?" The voice came. Cora climbed the stone steps, her boots finding the familiar level of each stair in the darkness, and pressed her shoulder against the limestone slab. The snow had frozen into a hard crust on the exterior, and she had to use the flat pole of her axe to shatter the ice around the frame before the slab would slide back along its timber groove. When the opening cleared, the light of her candle revealed Jared Conley standing in the snow, his face a gray, frozen mask of exhaustion, his arms wrapped around his 2 small children, Leo, age 7, and Hattie, age 5, who were bundled together in a single, stiff horse blanket. "Their mother's gone with the fever, Cora," Conley whispered, his breath rising in a final desperate cloud as he stumbled down the steps into the warmth of the shaft. "Our cabin's out of wood, and the stove flue cracked last night. The little ones. They've stopped shivering, Cora. I didn't know where else to go." Cora did not ask him for explanations. She took the children from his arms, their bodies stiff and heavy in her hands, and carried them down into the chamber, moving them directly into the blanket tent, where the river stones were still radiating a gentle, stable warmth of $58, circ, text, $. She wrapped them in her father's dry wool blankets, then set her ironwood pot on the stove's capstone to melt snow, her fingers moving with that calm, unhurried efficiency that had always been her family's response to any crisis. She fed Jared Conley a cup of hot bean broth first, her authority on the matter absolute, as she forced him to sit near the stove and thaw his hands before he was permitted to touch his children. She watched the children's eyes slowly refocus as the warmth of the tent registered in their bodies, their breathing losing that shallow, rapid quality of advanced hypothermia and settling into the deep, regular rhythm of sleep. Leo was the first to speak, his voice a tiny, hesitant sound in the quiet chamber. "It's like the ground's alive, Pa. It's warm. It's the Earth's memory, Leo," Cora said, her voice remaining quiet and direct as she handed him his cup of broth. "Your father's going to build you one of these shelters tomorrow, and you'll sleep warm through the rest of the winter." She spent the next hour showing Jared Conley the simplified drawing she had copied onto a piece of canvas, using her graphite pencil to point out the critical dimensions of the dry-stacked stone walls and the cold sink trench. She explained how the 1-2-inch air gap between the double walls functioned as a convective barrier, and how the snow drift above would act as an additional insulating blanket once the structure was sealed. "This is not a difficult build, Jared," she said. "The limestone on the south bank of the creek is already split by the frost. You can have the walls up and the roof on in 36 hours if you work with the slope instead of fighting it." He looked at the canvas drawing, his hands still red and tender from the cold, tracing the lines of the ventilation system with the focused attention of a man who had just been handed his family's survival. He had come to her door expecting pity, expecting to be carried to town or housed as an object of charity, but Cora had given him something more valuable than shelter. She had given him the engineering, the tools, and the expectation of his own competence. He stood up at the end of the hour, his shoulders straight, his eyes holding a quiet, purposeful light that had not been there when he knocked. "I'll begin the digging as soon as the sun clears the hill, Cora," he said. "The little ones. Can they stay here until the roof is on?" "They'll stay here, Jared," she said. "They'll be warm, and Bramble will keep them company." The news of Jared Conley's survival and the warmth of his new hillside dugout spread through the valley with the quiet, unstoppable momentum of water finding a crack in a dam. Within 2 weeks of his departure, the path between Cora's keep and the surrounding claims had been worn into a deep, well-traveled trench in the snow as neighbor after neighbor made the trek to her hill to examine the design for themselves. They came with their hands bandaged, their faces pinched with the cold, their pride entirely gone, not asking for charity, but asking for the knowledge that would allow them to protect their own families. Mabel Greer came first, her husband Walt being incapacitated by frostbite on his fingers, and she spent 3 hours in the chamber, studying the clay mortar consistency and the placement of the ironwood flue. She was a practical, hard-working woman, and she understood the logic of the cold sink immediately, her mind calculating the savings in firewood before she'd even left the room. "We're burning half a quart a week in the cabin, Cora," she said, running her hand along the dry-stack limestone walls. "And the kids are still coughing from the smoke. If I build this under our workshop, I can keep the whole place at 50 degrees on 10 logs a day." "10 logs is sufficient, Mabel," Cora replied. "As long as you pack the clay tight around the intake pipe and don't let the draft stagnate at the ceiling. The curve of the roof is what guides the warm air down." By the first week of February, 7 families in the valley had constructed hillside dugouts based on Cora's canvas drawings, their chimneys creating a new pattern of thin, steady smoke trails along the western ridges of the claim. The community's physical outcome had begun to shift. The mortality rate among their livestock dropped as families used the passive warmth of their dugouts to shelter young calves and poultry, and the acrid, creosote smoke that had plagued their cabins was replaced by the clean, efficient burn of properly seasoned wood. Gideon Croft watched this shift from the window of the Vance cabin, his isolation compounding daily as the families who had previously depended on his store for credit began to bypass Duswell entirely, their survival no longer tied to his financial terms. On the 11th of February, after his foreman reported that 2 more Herefords had died in the drafty barn and that the propane heaters were empty, Croft rode to her hill alone. He found Cora in the yard, her axe in her hand, her shaggy brown goat Brambles standing beside her like a silent sentinel. The temperature sat at -18, circ, text, $, but Cora stood in her wool coat without her gloves, her face showing nothing but the calm, unhurried composure of someone who occupied her territory